So I'm just going to kind of dive in because I've got some stuff I want to talk about, and this is kind of what's been working for me. That's the context of what we've been looking at. So when we started this, we kind of had the idea of like a TED Talk in mind, so I'm going to try to keep it a pace like that. It won't be near as good as any of that stuff, though. So this is just a quote that I like that I've been thinking about for years. I'm relatively new to higher education. I was in industry for about 18 or 19 years and then moved into higher education over the last 4 or 5 years. I was out at a little university, Fort Hays State University, for about 3 years and then was fortunate enough to come here. So I'm kind of new to Colorado Mesa. So this is what it works for me, is I prefer teaching naked. Just kidding, I'm not taking my clothes off for this. But anyhow, this was a book. I heard Jose Bowen speak to us out at Fort Hays a couple years ago, and it helped me kind of conceptualize, or at least work on some things that or help me with some things that I've been working on versus just lecturing to students. When we do our education, a lot of times we're taught certain ways and we're not real keen on those, so we want to try to improve those. So I'm trying to continue to improve those, and I'm not saying that it's perfect by any means. But what Jose presented was 3 things that I'm going to unpack during this discussion. One, and the idea of this book, it kind of catches your attention, but what his whole idea is with this, this book goes through the idea of how higher education is changing with online education and face-to-face education and everything. And so what his model is to not necessarily, ignore the online. That's here. There's some value to that. But when we have students in the classroom, how do we take advantage of that? How do we add value to that classroom teaching event versus just making it all online? So this discussion, and what I'm trying to do is when I'm teaching on campus, on face-to-face, how can I maximize that with lecture activities and technology? And then I also teach online, so then I've got something that I try to do online, and I'm trying to figure out how to be the most efficient at all of those. And then technology, it's not a tool, it's a tool, not a strategy, so I continue to try to find the balance there, and then I'll wrap it up with a little bit with regards to learning, is about continuous change. So let me just dive in. I'm going to talk briefly about lectures. I don't know about you guys, but I still fall back on them sometime, but I try to be disciplined enough. I mean, for some reason, all the literature that I read and the books and the speakers I hear say, lectures are bad, don't do them. I'm just not quite there yet, because when I don't do them, sometimes students seem a little confused. So I think we're in a little bit of the wild, wild west in the transition from just lectures to activities and technology. So I use them. I try to use them sparingly. Typically, my classes, I teach like organizational behavior and human resource management, operations management, leadership courses, and I teach those at the BBA and the master's level. So I have a nice variety of students. Sometimes they're 50-minute classes, sometimes they're 75-minute classes, and then here in a little bit, I get to teach a 3-hour class tonight for once a week. So you kind of have these different links, and then I also teach the org behavior class online, which isn't time constrained. But I use these lectures to basically, I try to become, like I said, a little more disciplined about just going in and doing lectures, and I threaten the students sometimes, if you guys want me to talk for 3 hours, I can, and they know that I can, and they'd rather do something different than hear me lecture for that amount of time. So I try to use them very specifically, and I'll go through a couple examples of that. So I've been really working on the last couple years of coming up with just activities in the classroom. I mean, my early training is engineering, so I tend to be a little more analytical. So I like things that are process-orientated, maybe logical and stuff. So I'm trying to get creative with the classroom activities, and it is pretty fun to try that. But I've also found that there's some nice benefits of having the students actually do things during the class period versus me just getting up and lecturing and them just listening. I can't remember the gentleman's name that came last Thanksgiving that spoke to us. Does anybody remember his name? I should have looked it up. But anyhow, he talked about putting people in groups of 2, groups of 3, dyads and triads. And I'd done that before. I just didn't know what it was called. So I've started to do that more and more. Instead of putting people into large groups, like groups of 5 or 6, I tend to have them work on these activities in just 2 because it's harder to hide in groups of 2. And sometimes I'll allow them to get into groups of 3. The other thing is I have less issues with distractions. I mean, I've come to realize over the last 4 years that students sometimes when you're lecturing use that time to do classwork for other classes during that. I was surprised about that. I never did that, but then I was like, what are you doing over there? I'm doing my homework for this next class. It's like, well, okay, that's pretty efficient use of time, but I'd rather you be engaged. So the more activity stuff that I do, the less distractions I have and the less I have to worry about that. I don't kick technology out of my classrooms. I try to simulate the workplace. I don't mind them bringing their phones or laptops or tablets, whatever. And then I use those as examples of like, that's not appropriate use of it right now or something. So I try to help the students understand you're going to have these challenges in the workplace with technology. So let's try to sort some of that out in the classroom too. But when we do activities, most of the time it doesn't use their technology, so they aren't distracted by it. And then they create meaning based off their own experience, and then they're also able to share their findings and have some discussion around it. So I'm talking about things with regards to like organizational behavior. We're talking about teamwork and motivation and workplace conflicts and conflict management. These things can sometimes be fairly abstract. They're hard to practice in the classroom, but most of these students have experienced it. They've had an experience in the workplace where they were demotivated. Or if we have to, we bring it to the classroom and we talk about motivation in the classroom. But most of the students I find have actually had some experience with these things. So this is just an example, and on your sheet, on the second page of this, I provided an example of one that I just did last week or right before spring break. I created the scavenger hunt. And, this thing may sound silly, but I've realized that just like adults versus kids, we like to have fun when we're learning things. So I was teaching a leadership class right before spring break, and I created the scavenger hunt, and I put them in teams. Now, they didn't know it, but the teams that I put them in, some of these were the best students and some of these were the worst students. So there's a little bit of method to my madness between putting these teams together. And then they had to run around campus and find all these things, and I only gave them like 40 minutes to do it, so there's no way they could find them all if they didn't develop a strategy, and they had points when they came back, and we wrote the points up, so it was a little competition. And then we unpacked it with some discussion after that about how did the team work, where did you guys assign roles, did you design your strategy? So this is just one example of what worked for me with a quick activity that was fun to do. It took me like an hour to come up with this activity, put it on some paper, and then we did it during class, and now all they want to do is do scavenger hunts. So I don't know, we're not going to do that tonight again. So that's a little bit of what worked for me on the activities. Now let me talk about technology quickly. I like the technology. I like D2L at Fort Hays. We use Blackboard, and I tend to use that as much as I can for my on-campus class and my online classes. I think that I try to create these things we call reusable learning objects, so I create them once, and I can use them again and again and again and again. And so once you do put the time in to create it, it becomes pretty easy to use. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. I don't like to reinvent the wheel. I've got a lot of other things to do, and I don't need to be doing, creating simulations and things like that if there's already good ones out there. Most of the textbook publishers that I use seem to be getting really good about providing these sources. I use a lot of Pearson and Wiley, McGraw-Hill stuff. So they have a lot of things that I've integrated into my on-campus class and my online class. And then also, I use D2L exclusively for all the grading. I explain to the students that you need to manage your grade. I grade things as quickly as I can, and then they can see their grades and understand where they are. And also, it helps me improve my efficiency with grading. So that's where I'm trying to use technology outside the classroom to help my classroom session be a little bit more efficient. So here's a quick example. I don't know if I think this will work. This is, I do a literature review every semester, and I got about a minute left. All right. So I do a literature review every semester, and so instead of telling the students how to do the literature review, I created a quick YouTube video, and I threw it up on, let me stop that. I put it up on D2L so they can watch it, and now I don't have to explain it every time that I do it. So that's an online thing that I also brought into the classroom. There's simulations for my classes that are already created, so I use those a lot in my classrooms or in my leadership class and my org behavior class that the textbook publishers already created. Lecture capture, most textbook publishers already have these lectures with much better sounding people than me reading them or talking about them, so I use some of that in my classrooms as well. Then a couple quick things to wrap it up. I use the calendar exclusively in D2L. My syllabus kind of has the weekly things, but then the calendar is where they go to see what's going on every week. I use rubrics for the grading, to help all my grading. I hardly hand back any paper in my classrooms. I grade almost everything through D2L with drop boxes, and I use rubrics to grade them. And then also there's a nice feature, I don't know if you found it, but you can record feedback in D2L. If you're tired of typing feedback, you can click the record button, you can record it. If you have an iPad or a tablet, you can actually record video. Not too big on doing that yet for feedback, but that option is there. One quick thing on change. I don't know how much you guys are, to me, I feel like higher education is going through a lot of change right now. I'm in the middle of reading this book, Do It Yourself University, and she came and spoke to Fort Hays a year or so ago. Open education resources. There's a ton of stuff out there that is basically open access that we can use in our classrooms. So I'm trying to integrate some of those things in to my classroom as well. Pretty good website for a lot of those open education resources. So with that, a little bit, I was like 30 seconds over maybe. So the idea now is that what we'd like to do, and for those those seats actually weren't meant to sit in back against the wall. They were meant to be like pulled away from the table. But anyhow, if you guys could get into table groups, and then what I want you to do for about the next 10 minutes is I've got some questions to think about. You don't have to use these, but I'm curious to what you guys are doing, what you're thinking about, and we'll get the discussion going. So you got 10 minutes to work on this in your table groups. Go.